Welcome to the Rare Earth Exchanges podcast, where power, politics, and the world's most coveted materials collide. Rare earth elements power the backbone of tomorrow's most critical technologies. With China dominating global production, the U.S. and its allies must align strategically to ensure a stable future. This urgency prompted tech entrepreneurs Daniel O'Connor and Dustin Olson to launch Rare Earth Exchanges, a news and insight platform built to equip stakeholders and decision makers with the tools and intelligence needed to reduce dependency and build prosperous resilience. Let's get into it.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Rare Earth Exchanges podcast. I'm your host, Dustin, joined by my co-host, Daniel. And today our guest is Jacob Clayton, who is the CEO and co-founder of a company called Sagint and is a former Marine Corps Reserve Lieutenant Colonel with 18 years of service who pioneered a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So, Jacob, welcome to the show.
Dustin, Daniel, thank you for having me.
Jacob, we are excited to talk to you. This is very much I want to say a big departure from our typical guests here on the show, especially with your efforts at Sagint. And at Sagint, you guys are trying to use blockchain tokenization, zero knowledge proof cryptography to give kind of compliancy a trackable source or an effort, right? So just could you, for the layman here who's listening to the show, could you just kind of break that down for us and talk about Sagint and what you guys are trying to do?
Dustin, it's funny when you bring it up that way, because when you lead with the technology, there's this disconnect from, hey, what problem are we trying to solve? And the technology was selected only after we spent a couple years in South America, Middle East, Africa, Indo-Pacific, trying to understand what the problem was. And the core thing that we wanted to prove, which splinters into 1,000 topics, is create a traceability system that enables the assets to be compliant, bankable, and insurable. And that was a tough challenge, but what we're finding, it's the timing of the market, timing of regulatory development. Now is the time, to scale this solution. And part of why we chose the technology we did is because digital assets and the way that we have engineered and conducted our legal regulatory, engineering is to make sure that these digital assets sit on what we call the Uniform Commercial Code Chapter 12, which is a controllable electronic record. Without getting into all the details, that vector ensures that, yes, and I'll do a deep dive into the compliance aspect, but if you can demonstrate compliance and you can do a lot of the underwriting process, you actually create a bankable asset. And with that, because it's being traced, you're modeling the risk in real time. Insurance companies love to see that. So if they're building delivery insurance or various other products. So that is the key thing we position ourselves to solve. And I will say, even though the Clarity Act has not been passed yet, it just got out of committee last week. The Clarity Act is the tokenization taxonomy. It's going to be the North Star for the United States. And there's, 4 categories they call. There's securities, commodities, but the last one is a digital tool. So that's what we have been building, is a digital tool that can answer your compliance, bankability, insurability, data requirements. Now, what that actually does for industry is solve a pain point, because there's actually legislation since 1970 on supply chain illumination requirements. Those policies that have developed significantly, especially in the last few years, put more and more requirements on these supply chain nodes to say, where'd you get your stuff from? And it can't be sourced from foreign entities of concern or fiat countries. So China, North Korea, Russia, Iran. How do you prove that? And it becomes a difficult, problem to do, because supply chains are dynamic. They're somewhat living organisms, and you have to monitor it in real time. Otherwise, you're going to find out a year or 2 years after the fact, after you've done significant, investigation. So our solution monitors in real time supply chain activity, and we're right at the node level.
Fascinating. So how does a Marine like you find themselves in deep technology such as this?
Yeah, it's a long story. I actually, when I was 14, I joined the seminary. So I studied to be a Catholic priest for 7 years, made the transition to an infantry officer in the Marine Corps, 15 years, Iraq, Afghanistan, throughout the Indo-Pacific, running a security program, but it was essentially a compliance program for 22 embassies and consulates. And that experience, so you're doing these week-long due diligence sessions at the U.S. embassies, and you're always the enemy coming in because you're trying to find the things. There's a 704-point inspection you're doing, but it was fascinating. I'd say anybody from the Big Four auditing firms or the assurance will find the same thing. Once you see the checklist, hey, here's the things we expect you to do, and then get on the ground, you're going to find one or two problems. One, they are trying and falling short, of meeting those standards, or they're trying to cover it up and you got to cut through that. So it was a very interesting 3 years just to make sure that, those in the 22 embassies and consulates, they're adhering to the security standards that were set forth. I will say I ended my active duty career. I'm still in the reserves, working with MIT Lincoln Labs, and the Marine Corps had a program that they're still running called Force Design. And a subcomponent of that was reconnaissance and counter reconnaissance. So I'd been doing a lot of work there, from electric drive UTV development and demonstration, from concept to we're driving around the desert in this amazing machine. And one of the problems we were trying to solve is the distributed energy problem. So I was working with MIT Lincoln Labs. We developed about 22 different prototypes with an individual named Eric Limpacher. He's since spun out a company from that, but there's a solution that we found, which was aluminum. And we found if we deoxidize it with gallium and indium, then that creates high-grade heat and hydrogen, which you can recharge your batteries with through a fuel cell. So it was a tech-heavy, end to the active duty portion. And I was in the light armored reconnaissance community doing a lot of.
Jacob, I wanted to just interject the law. There is a rule now. I believe it's a statute, and it's called DFAR. Could you maybe explain for the audience what it is, why it's important, and when does it go into being?
Absolutely. So I'll actually start here in the National Security Strategy that was released in 2025. There's 3 separate sections that say, hey, we as a nation need to get better at supply chain or supply intelligence. And part of what we're finding, and you could stitch together a host of regulations, but we'll state a DFARS, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. And the specific article is 252.225.7052. And this specifically says, hey, if you have any magnet, tantalum, or tungsten by January 1, 2027, you're going to have to trace it. And it's not just, hey, I bought this from, the next node in the supply chain. It has to ensure that there's no FIOC or foreign entity of concerned countries that have touched it, from mining, refining, processing at all. And those 4 countries, which I mentioned earlier, that's they hold, and China holds most of the supply chain nodes and production activity. So it's, it'll be a challenge, I think, for industry, a good challenge to adhere to that.
So, and I think that, Jacob and Dustin, this is what makes this topic of Sagint and the company. You've spent years in the military looking at supply chains, compliance, and it's sort of started to come together. And now it's really coming together because there's a law, or, a set of executive branch rules now that compel organizations to be able to trace their rare earth element supply chain from source, from upstream through midstream to downstream. So if we could just talk a little bit about why that is important and how it works today, the supply chain at a high level, how it's going to work in the future under DFAR, and why that is important.
Absolutely. So if you start with, now, most of these supply chains are not linear. So this is a vast oversimplification, but you have your mine that produces, let's say, a rare earth feedstock, and it goes to your refining processing company. Maybe that's co-located, maybe that's at a separate location. How do you know that? And there's three scenarios. I ship 100 tons, I receive 100 tons, I ship 100, I get 90. Both of those are, somewhat, I mean, the 100 is acceptable. The 100 to 90 is something got lost in the mix. But then if you go 100 to 110, it's, hey, somebody put something in the supply chain, and there's typically, one reason, those are illicit materials that are trying to get into formal, market activity supply chains. And so you have to monitor for that. We just call that the mass balance, problem. And so as you're moving up the supply chain, it goes from your refining to your product component companies to, your systems integrators. All of them have now a responsibility to say, I know where these minerals came from. I would say that's very difficult to do, at this point, because a lot of the methods to track that are PDF, paper-based documents that can easily be forged. And I brought up, initially the trying to obscure where you're getting materials from, because when you're in these, especially defense supply chains, you're getting a premium, for these materials if you can prove they're not from China. So there's maybe an economic element for injecting illicit materials. There could be other reasons, and we can spend an entire podcast just on this. But just suffice to say, it's a major concern. So much so that in that supply chain, which the simple answer to your question is paper-based documents are easy to forge.
Understood.
And retrospectively, doing this becomes time, value, money, for a business. And what we, our contention is they should be able to solve this in real time. Now, something I think that is, important to hang on here is, as the minerals are being processed, we're talking about compliance, right? PDF documents adhering to certain regulations, and you may be inspected, you may not. Sometimes you can't do 100% tests, for these supply chains. But the compounding issue is bankability and insurability. So as the U.S., has Project Vault, Pack Silica, various projects where they're with Project Vault injecting capital into these supply chains to control, influence the physical supply chain. It's difficult to underwrite these projects. And I think you've covered this a lot, on this podcast. And you see, financing a mine is not a straightforward process. Financing even a refining company, is not a straightforward process. A lot of risk. And our objective in the company, and I can walk you through how we've demonstrated this, is to make sure the representation risk is measured well. And as we call representation risk, it's what is the difference between the bit and the atom, and how do we know it? And there are two, hard and fast rules. It's process integrity and mass balance. So if you can prove those two things, it's essentially Claude Shannon information entropy combined with the laws of conservation. You can have high assurance that you can't fake physics. And if your mass balance numbers spike, at some point, then there's something strange going on. You're breaking the laws of physics.
So Jacob, what I'm deriving from this, and tell me if I'm correct here, but it sounds like a risk-based approach. It sounds like mass balance and the other element, when you bring those together and you see that they align, that there's lower risk of leakage, right, or of holes. Today, I can only imagine. Well, first of all, 98% of the product heavy rare earth comes out of China today. About 90% of the light rare earth comes out of China today. So, billions of dollars are being invested right now. These are heavy, big stakes with national security implications. I mean, it's very serious business. And so we have a few of these different mine to magnet ecosystems. And Sagent's working with one of them. You're working with an ecosystem that's mine, refinery, magnet production, right? Is that sort of the Sagent's goal, is to work with these different mine to magnet ecosystems and introduce this blockchain-based technology to ensure that these organizations are DFAR compliant?
That's exactly it. And what we call our commercial or organic growth strategy is to demonstrate value, compliant, bankable, insurable assets. We pre-solve a host of problems for you. And we are working, in one of those, and we have publicly announced that with ReElement. And that does include a consortium of other players, and there's just regular announcements coming out on that. And we want to work with all of them. Anyone in the magnet supply chain that supplies to Department of War, we would like to work with. And the key, I think, point of departure here is on 4 June, so just last week, Congress in the House Armed Services Committee released an approved provision, and it's the mineral traceability section, which will be part of the NDAA. Now, that's the National Defense Authorization Act. Why that's important is there's a couple components that, as I said earlier, we have a organic commercial strategy. We also have a government strategy. And with this government strategy, it essentially makes traceability a compliance requirement. There's a couple aspects, of that. We've been talking a lot about magnets, but this provision includes lithium, titanium, cobalt, and anything else that the Department of War deems necessary that's part of their critical material supply chains. So things that go into F-35s and submarines. So that's important, to understand where it's coming from. There's a couple, elements where you essentially get and these are my words, like a safe harbor type provision, because if you participate, you're demonstrating, an intent, to be compliant. There are 3 elements where if you do not participate in the traceability program, there's loss of government contracts, loss of future government contracts, holding pay, because I'd go back to the 3 parts in the national security strategy. The U.S. government, as I've just observed, has stated they want to understand the supply chains, and they're getting out and just as you said, they're deploying billions of dollars, rightfully so, to control the physical infrastructure. And now they're moving out to have the information infrastructure so they can get live, understanding of risks in the supply chain.
Yeah, and it's a really fascinating time. I would add to this that we believe we are in a period now, Jacob, of the last 30, 40 years, efficiency, globalization and efficiency were the name of the game. So multinational corporations would outsource work and be decentralized, and everybody just assumed just in time and everything worked. We've now moved into a different period we call Great Powers Era 2.0, where resilience now is a focus of many countries. And so now there's a scramble to figure out how to rebuild supply chains, whether it's rare earth elements, critical minerals, but even pharmaceuticals, other chemicals, etc. So, all these things are dovetailing. Now, we hear a lot about blockchain and why it might be good for some use case like this, but could you maybe describe the technology and how, make it palpable? How does that work? So if somebody's watching us that's part of one of these mine to mineral operations, how would deploying Sagent impact their business?
Absolutely. One thing to start, with any data system, garbage in is garbage out. And why you start with a PDF that could be fraudulent is kind of a no-go for us, because unless we can verify it, we just have to assume, at face value that the information has been represented by somebody. And that representation risk is something we have to measure. So we have to understand who represented it. Do they have a history of making correct representations? So the reason blockchain is important is because it's traceable, immutable, and auditable. And we are, that was our starting point. But we also had to make sure that the high quality data coming in, we measure twice, cut once, phrase. We need to measure a couple times, specifically on process integrity and mass balance. And we actually do that. And we talked about what we're doing with ReElement specifically. We are pulling ERP data, people on the ground, and IoT sensors. So that data that's pulling in, we're very selective with. And Sagint doesn't hold that data. That is proprietary supply chain information, and we don't want to even hold it. We want to take the information that answers compliance questions. And right now there's 108 questions that need to be answered regularly and along the internal process integrity. So the overall architecture is starting from the right, where we say, what regulations do you need to adhere to? We decompose those into Boolean or range answer questions. That question, once we have it, we know what kind of data and the specific data we need to answer that. So then we know what we need to collect for. And then we don't just reveal that information. We use a zero knowledge proof. So we hash, which means you can't decrypt it. We hash it, create a block on the blockchain or the Merkle tree, and we pre-answer those questions, and that's embedded into that single hash. So at any moment, you can say, at this time, date, location, here are the answers to your compliance questions. And it just continues to add to the blockchain. So you can see if somebody was non-compliant and they try to tamper with it, one, they can't, and two, it would be evident. So that's why we settled on blockchain specifically. And I'll go back. The beauty here is, now that we tokenize on the Uniform Commercial Code, you transform that high quality data into actually a legal instrument under the Uniform Commercial Code. And this is where I'll go one step further. We don't just tokenize information once. For process integrity, we have to re-tokenize the information as it progresses through the system. So the way our system architecture works is we actually have 3 tokens. The first is your feedstock token. Collect all the information about the quantity, quality, and a host of data points, where it came from, et cetera. And, we have the mine information, right there. We convert that feedstock token, once it's in process, into a processing token. And all that's doing is saying, you at this time, date, location, this person implemented X, procedure, and they got, 1 ton in, and 50 kilograms out of neodymium, let's just say. So that process token inherits all the information, from the feedstock token. And that hash, it's a very small bit of information, but you have that traceability. You can look back. After the process is complete, you actually have a product. So we convert that to we're calling it a digital warehouse receipt. That's what is actually tokenized on top of the Uniform Commercial Code. So now you are answering your compliance questions. You know some of your production information. Only the compliance requirements that are required are what you can reveal. And now that asset is bankable and insurable, and it demonstrates compliance if the actual actions or the events that occurred are compliant. So all of that happens after we bring let's say the refinery through a listing process. So we ask all the compliance questions in the beginning. We get the demonstration of documents. So we have complete process integrity. Now that's what happens in one node in the supply chain, and it's a recursive process. So as it goes from mine to refine, the exact same thing happens again.
That's really fascinating. If we looked at today all the different mine to magnet supply chain scenarios in the world today, I'm going to go out on a limb and say 0% would be DFAR compliant, unless they're working with a Sagint, or they have some other methodology to try to process integrity where they can prove what they're getting is not coming from communist China. It's coming from an acceptable source. It's managed in a way, it's not shipped back over there to refine. Right? Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes. The problem is there's no public data that's available that says, are these mines compliant or not? And what I know is we can measure indirectly. There's public data saying 30% of the supply chain nodes that took money from the U.S. government for battery, and this was, I think, between the IRA and the CHIPS Act, and about 30% of them are actively monitoring the supply chain, and others aren't. And what doesn't apparently exist are enforcement mechanisms, for those batteries. So with rare earths specifically, the magnet supply chain, those enforcement mechanisms are coming. So I think your assertion is correct. And partly that's because these are new regulations, but also partly it's something industry hasn't needed to comply with, in an absolute term. And I say that because in regulation currently, I could point this up. It's in the NDAA. The demonstration mechanism is self-auditing and voluntary compliance through a public database. So I don't know a single node in the supply chain that will voluntarily participate in a compliance program to reveal their proprietary supply chain information. So, the new regulation that will come down through the NDAA, I think will be, it will be, a change in industry. However, I think implemented correctly, and this is where Sagent's positioning itself, that we can actually make that friction point very smooth. So reducing the coefficient of friction as low as possible. And it's trying to pre-solve not only for the compliance issue, but bankability and insurability issues.
And on that note, we track the Chinese quite a bit, and they have this Baotao exchange, and they're doing something similar. And remember, what they're doing is they're going to start controlling their leakage so it doesn't come to us too. So we had better start moving fast. I have some more questions, Dustin. I don't want to monopolize Jacob's time, but we had better move fast, Jacob, because we've been asleep at the wheel.
Couldn't agree more. And as fast as, and we've had 45 different engagements with Congress, so Senate and the House, and there's quite a few people tracking this from a legislative, side, and about 60 engagements across, the executive branch, and all the name brand, folks that are participating, from OEMs to, some of the key mining companies. And I think, generally they would all agree with your statement. We can have all these great policies and we can make these investments, but if we don't have a verification layer, it puts us at a disadvantage. And that's actually something we covered extensively. Dr. Ben Jensen and I published a piece in CSIS. We titled it Economic Warfare, and it was primarily a research piece that was based on a year and a half of research and some experience. And that was one of the key points, that verification is going to be required.
Dustin, yeah, very, very good points. Do you want to go ahead and ask a few? And I have some more questions on the economic warfare, but please.
Yeah. So, Jacob, surprising to me, there's 108 checkpoint things just for compliance. That seems like a lot to just get started. So what does this process look like? I feel like the adoption rate would probably be really low just because of the amount of work just to create your first token.
Yeah, and I'll break apart, the answer to that question in two pieces. The first is, and it's an onboarding question, and a lot of what we have is archetyped. So, if you're a mine, there's a certain archetype of deployment. If you're a refined, certain archetype product company, yet another different archetype. And we have spent, better part of a year and a half making sure those archetypes are efficient, because we don't want to spend 3 months at a mine, customizing this to their operations. We want to efficiently get in days and set this up so that it's minimally disruptive and the benefits are realized, almost instantly. And I'll say some of the benefits are if you're tokenizing your supply chain, there's a host of financial products you can build right on top of that. Forward sell at future production, you know, insurance, delivery insurance, and the quality of the data. We do have Argonne National Labs looking over our shoulder, and checking the math and science. So it's not just the company, and we want that, and we invite more partners to work with us on that. So part of it is how quickly can we deploy, from your question. The second is, if it's required, are there other methods of doing this monitoring? And there are big four accounting firms, there's a ton of legal firms that would charge you, and part of what we're trying to do is reduce the cost of compliance. So each token, it's a flat fee, and you're paying pennies per token, where with a auditing firm or law firm that's doing it from the ground up, you're paying for billable hours. Those add up quickly. And if you have the situation where you have to do an audit, that bill becomes significant pretty quickly.
Fascinating. Truly, like it sounds like a lot, but it also sounds like you guys are streamlining the effort to reduce costs, get it done faster, and in a non-disruptive way. I feel like in this industry, people where it has been so opaque, not a lot of things are discussed. Everyone kind of does it their own way, and that creates a lot of different processes and operations. And yet we wonder why we're all wondering how to fix it.
Yeah.
So
And just to hang on that point, these nodes, I mean, there are major players taking huge risk, and they lose sometimes. Sometimes they lose quite a bit of money on a mining project, or geopolitical events will influence things. And we saw that really firsthand with M23 and the DRC. And so a lot of the risk that these players have to assume aren't just operational. And what I think really helps with the focus of the U.S. government, they are getting after it. And I applaud this administration. They have done an absolutely amazing job getting these physical supply chain nodes financed. And it's still difficult. What we're trying to do is just position ourselves as a value-added player.
So a question on that, and we agree with you, Jacob, that the administration has done more than any other administration that we've seen, or read about. Now, part of this, I mean, there's 100 points, and totally get your point. If you go to a big four accounting firm or law firm and do this end to end, you're going to be in it millions and millions of dollars, and it's going to take a long time. So I really see the ROI. I can see it now, but there's an issue, and that is, quality compliance is not just a checklist and not just technology. It's a culture. It's a culture, and people have to think about it, and they have to work in a different way sometimes. I mean, in your experience, looking at in the military and looking at like, does that require change management? Are some companies or some ecosystems going to have to like hire consultants to change how they behave, essentially, to change the culture?
Yeah, you asked that question, and the first thing I think about is when we had 22 embassies and consulates. We showed up, and most of the time, those inspections went well. When they didn't, it's almost like you can smell it, as you showed up, because the culture seemed like they weren't focused on the mission. And that happens. It's just human nature. Some people
Yeah.
are disengaged, and there could be a host of reasons. And what I have found, just working with the folks we are so far, that culture, they, a lot of these nodes have taken money from the U.S. government. That culture, they are focused on, the America First agenda. They're focused on making sure that we deliver for the Department of War. So they're highly engaged, and I think you're absolutely right that there will be change management. For individuals inputting information to individuals caring a lot, about why we're doing this. And I think you're going to see some process improvement. That's a great segue for, consulting groups to come in and offer some of that expert guidance, because it's not just about compliance, it's also about efficiency. And if you're seeing that days on end are going by and the production is not on track, there's a host of ways that can be fixed. So I think it's a great question. It's human in process, and as more production gets online, I think will invariably be more and more efficient, and digital tools will help us, gain those efficiencies. But I think it's to be seen, because most of these investments have just happened, and you are finding companies that are increasing production as fast as humanly possible. So they're probably not most efficient up front, but they're getting there soon, and it's a great endeavor to help them get as efficient as possible.
And I would say I agree with you. And as a company, are you taking the approach of, and if you can't answer this, that's okay too, but is Sagent taking the approach that we're going to do a channel model where we're going to find, for example, system integrators? I used to work for a defense system integrator in Raytheon, for example, now RX, right? But we had 600 employees or 600 bodies in Raytheon at the time. Are you going to work with a channel of system integrators and consultants that work with different supply chains? Drone supply chains, an example. There's a change in, I think, FCC or FCC, I think, and there's going to be a huge shift in drone production in the United States. Okay. Now they're under the same rules. So they're going to need a framework, and you're still not a huge company. You can't be everywhere. So what's your strategy to bring this technology to these vast industries that have big companies that need this help? Like, how are you guys going to do a partner program, or are you going to do it yourself, or what's your thoughts on that?
Now, the simple answer is we will partner 7 ways to Sunday. And the reason for that is, even if there's one big four accounting firm that's like the best in mineral supply chain practice, that's a tremendous amount of expertise that you only need episodically. And episodically meaning, different companies will come in and have needs at different, and so our objective is to partner and, just like you said, have a partner network. And what we could do uniquely, we are going to be the best at. What we see as, a need from these customers, we're going to make sure we partner with the best to deliver, those services. And but part of the problem is, when you look at a cobalt supply chain, or a titanium supply chain, or a lithium, or a neodymium, they start looking very different, and different locations, different sets of people involved. So that's something we absolutely plan on partnering.
Yes. And one follow-on question: does this dovetail with ESG? So, we rank assets for investors in our rare earth exchanges. We have upstream, midstream, downstream. And part of the criteria, Jacob, are the ESG elements. Okay. And from the West, that's an important perspective, right? So does this fall under that category? In the future, will this kind of tokenization and compliance of rare earth and critical mineral supply chains, will this be a category of itself, or would it fall under an ESG category? Like, at a high level, where would this fall in, to understand?
So we wouldn't fall in the ESG category. What we would fall under is RegTech, regulation technology.
Okay.
If there is a piece of regulation that wants to measure X that can be measured, we'll absolutely measure it, and it'll be 109 compliance checkpoints. So why I answer it that way is, if you look at that ontology, not all regulations are the same in every jurisdiction. There are state regulations, there are federal regulations. And as we have brought on Ambassador Troy Futrell, who was the administration's appointee assistant secretary in Africa, there's 49 embassies that reported to him. There's a host of Africa engagement activities we have going on right now. And every single country in Africa has, their own set of regulations. So although we didn't touch on this when we talk about zero knowledge proofs and the compliance point of view, there's a polygon we put on a map and we make sure the requirements or the regulations, are adhered to wherever we're at. So if there is a subset of regulations that include ESG, those are easy to decompose, measure for, and monitor for.
Got it.
But I would say, and I'll shout out, to Whole Foods. Whole Foods has one of the best traceability programs, and they charge a premium for their product, their food. What they have to measure for, and this is, at a different scale, did these tomatoes come from no more than 3 counties away? And so
Right.
it's from a technology perspective, it's relatively easy to implement, geospatial polygons, location, calculate, so that's probably the best way to answer that question.
But one more, Dustin, but for example, we speak with government. So let's just take the Malaysian government. They're implementing a compliance regime of some type where they want to have their product that is pulled out of the ground processed there. So the Malaysian government could go to Sagint, and Sagint could implement that as an example, tighten up that so they can with confidence understand, as all these mines spring up, there's a system, there's process and there's systems to ensure that their rules. I'm just trying to pitch your company now that you can tailor this to different scenarios, different countries, etc.
Daniel, that's a great point, because what, the nuance you're bringing up is are the integrations. So you can implement this, and you also need to integrate with, if it is in Malaysia, their version of, Customs Border Patrol, their various export, controls. And, the beauty here is, as you're tracing these minerals to a port, you actually have control, or you have live visibility, of where the minerals are at, or where the produce is at. But there's a lot of integration, that would need to happen, and those are simple problems to solve from a technology perspective. This is where you're getting, you do need a bit of a whole of government buy-in to say, we want this traceability system because it'll help us validate compliance, and we'll have to integrate with 5 or 6 different ministries, as we do that. So from a tech perspective, easy. From a, I'd say, government coordination perspective, there's a lift there. We have found that out time and time again. We've worked with many different governments to present this as a solution, and we have advised on regulations, in South America and the Middle East specifically. So I think that's where you start, and that's actually where we're at with the U.S. government. As we did lobby, for the traceability standard to be added to the NDAA successfully, and it wasn't because we spent hundreds of millions of dollars. It's because of the merit of the argument.
But no, you guys are incredible. I mean, from serving the country, in the trenches to the most advanced compliance to help our country become resilient. It's amazing what you guys are doing. Dustin, please help me out.
You're good. So we're at the end of our time here, Jacob, and this has truly been a fascinating conversation. And I think between Dan and I, we are excited to see this technology come into the industry, simply because of what it'll mean in terms of helping us become self-reliant a bit more. For those that would be interested to talk to Sagint, Jacob, what is a great place for them to go to learn more, to reach out and connect?
I really appreciate the question, and thank you for having me on. Please visit Sagint.com, and you can get in contact with us through there. We, I think, do a pretty good job of demonstrating, how we're in market, our thoughts through our SEER publication, which comes out once a week, and we do monitor the market pretty closely. So you'll see our current thoughts on those topics.
Fantastic. hopefully we have you again on the show to get an update as things progress and we get closer to that January 1st deadline. But Jacob, thanks again. We appreciate you being here.
Dustin,
Thank you.
thank you so much.